My name is Leo, and I am a 30-year-old carpenter who finds peace in the scent of fresh wood. On that gray winter morning, the air was cold, and my heart was heavy with a feeling I couldn't explain. I used to think family was a golden shield, but my brother, Julian, turned it into a sharp sword. I looked at the legal documents on the table and felt a strange chill in my bones. I lost my mother's land in one afternoon, but I didn't know that losing it would make me a king. That day, I signed a paper that destroyed my life, but saved my soul. I whispered to myself, "Is this truly the end?" But my journey was just beginning. For 5 years, I lived in this old wooden house with my mother. Every morning, I woke up to the scent of pine and the sound of my tools. I spent my days as a humble carpenter and my nights by her bed. I remember the smell of fresh wood and my mother's smile. She was weak, but her voice was always kind. She always said, "Leo, your hands can create anything. Just trust your heart." I cared for her every day, cooking her soup and washing her clothes. I held her hand during her final, difficult nights. I whispered to myself, "I will stay with you until the very end." Julian and his wife, Clara, were very different. They lived in the city and were always too busy for a sick woman. They never called or sent money for her medicine or food. But the moment my mother closed her eyes for the last time, they arrived. I stood by her bed, and tears ran down my face. My hands were shaking with grief as I looked at her. Julian walked in wearing an expensive black suit and shiny shoes. Clara looked around the room with cold, greedy eyes. They didn't even look at our mother's peaceful face or say a quiet prayer. I felt a strange emptiness when I saw Julian's expression. He didn't cry for a single second. He looked at the house like it was a pile of gold, not a place of memories. I was holding my mother's thin hand, but Julian was holding a thick leather folder. I thought they came back because they loved her, but I knew now they only wanted the land. I took a deep sigh as the silence in the room became heavy and dark. I whispered to myself, "Something is wrong," as I watched Julian open that folder. Clara opened the leather folder and pulled out a yellow paper. Her voice was sharp and cold like a knife. "Look at this, Leo. Mother borrowed $50,000 from us years ago. She used it to pay for your medical bills and your school. You owe us this money." I stared at the paper and my heart began to beat very fast. I felt a cold shiver down my spine. I was shocked because I never heard about this debt before. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It looked like my mother's handwriting, but I wasn't sure. I didn't have any proof to argue with them. I thought, this can't be true. Mother never told me. But I was just a poor carpenter with no power. Julian watched me with a dark, silent smile. Then, Julian walked toward me and put his hand on my shoulder. His hand felt heavy, but his voice was suddenly soft and kind. "Leo, don't worry," he said. "We are family, after all. Just sign the land over to us to pay the debt. You can stay in the small workshop in the back. You can keep working there forever. I will take care of you." I looked into his eyes and felt a small spark of hope in my chest. I thought, maybe he still loves me. Maybe he wants to protect me. I whispered to myself, maybe everything will be okay. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers. I signed my name slowly on the white paper. I felt a little bit of relief for a moment. The moment I finished, the air in the room changed. Clara grabbed the paper from the table. Her fake smile disappeared instantly. She walked to the front door and opened it wide. "Get out, Leo," she shouted. I couldn't move. I was completely confused. Julian didn't look at me anymore. He was busy looking at the land documents. "But Julian said I could stay in the workshop," I stammered. Clara laughed, and it was a cruel, loud sound. She grabbed my bag of clothes and threw it onto the wet grass outside. "Get out now before I call the police. This land is ours now. You have nothing left here." Julian stayed silent. He didn't even turn his head to say goodbye. I walked out into the cold rain. The sky was gray and the wind was biting. I stood there for a long time, holding my mother's old toolbox. It was the only thing I had left in this world. I didn't cry. My eyes were dry, but my soul was very tired. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in small scars and dust from years of hard work. The rain washed the dirt away, leaving them clean, but empty. I felt the cold water on my skin. I took a deep breath and listened to the rain. The world was very quiet. I stood still for a few minutes. I was alone, but I was still standing. I looked back through the window one last time. Julian and Clara were sitting at the dining table. Julian was pointing at a large red map on the table. He was smiling in a way I never saw before. He leaned closer to his wife. I saw his lips move. "We will be rich soon," he whispered. I knew something big was happening, and I was no longer a part of it. A few days later, I heard the shocking news. Julian had mortgaged every asset he owned. He used our mother's land and his expensive city house as security for a massive bank loan. He took $500,000 because he wanted to buy all the land around that secret project. I felt a strange coldness in my chest when I realized how far his greed went. I knew that he was taking a dangerous risk with our history. While he was laughing and drinking champagne in his luxury office, I was in a different world. I had to start over from scratch in a small, broken warehouse at the far edge of the city. I felt the dry dust in the air as I walked inside. I stood alone in that dark room and took a long, deep sigh. My body felt heavy, but my mind was finally clear. I thought about my mother's words as I picked up her old wood planer. My hands were shaking slightly as I touched the cold metal for the first time in weeks. I whispered to myself, "I will not give up." I started to work on a rough piece of oak, pushing the tool with all my strength. Sweat ran down my forehead, but I was extremely focused on the wood. I didn't look back at the life I lost. Julian thought he was buying the future. I knew I was building one. 5 years passed, like a fast river. I worked day and night in my small workshop, building my business from scratch, with nothing but my mother's old tools. One morning, I stood in front of a beautiful mahogany table. It was my first order for a famous 5-star hotel. My furniture company was finally a success. I felt a deep sense of peace as I touched the smooth wood. My hands were rough and covered in scars, but my heart was finally light. I knew that my hard work and craftsmanship were more valuable than any gold. At that same moment, in the city, Julian's world was falling apart. He was waiting for his millions, but he received a phone call that changed everything. I heard later that his face turned white, and the phone slipped from his cold fingers. His partner had disappeared with all the money, and the big city project was a scam. Julian lost his mind. He started to scream and threw his expensive chair against the wall. His hands were shaking violently, and he was gasping for air as if the room had no oxygen. Clara sat on the floor, buried her face in her hands, and cried until she couldn't breathe. I stood in my quiet workshop and took a deep sigh. I stayed still for a minute, letting the silence heal my old wounds. I looked at my workers and spoke clearly to them. I said, "Remember this. We don't just build tables. We build trust." Something my brother never understood. I whispered to myself, "I did it, Mother." I stood by my office window and watched the gray clouds. I felt a strange silence in my soul. I stayed still for a moment, letting the heavy news sink in. Julian had mortgaged his soul for a dream built on lies, and now, the bank was here to collect the debt. The legal papers were final. Julian had lost his luxury city house first, and then the bankmen arrived at our mother's land. Julian stood on the old wooden porch, the place where we used to play as children. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his hands were shaking as he held the cold metal keys. Clara was crying loudly, her face red and tired. They were forced to leave the house with only 2 small suitcases. There were no more expensive cars waiting in the driveway, no more city friends to help them. They had lost their reputation and their power. They stood on the cold sidewalk, looking back at the home they had stolen from me. A man walked to the front gate and nailed a large wooden sign to the post. In bold, black letters, it said, "Auction." I knew that this was the end of Julian's empire. I felt a mix of sadness for my brother, but a deep relief for my mother's memory. Julian looked at the auction sign, and his shoulders dropped. He looked small and defeated. I took a deep sigh and closed my eyes. Justice had finally arrived. The day of the auction was bright and sunny. I arrived at our old family home, the place where everything began and ended. I saw Julian standing near the gate. He looked tired and old. His clothes were wrinkled, and his hair was messy. He was looking at every person who arrived, waiting for a miracle. I knew he was hoping to keep the land, but he had no money left. I felt a strange sense of calm as I parked my car. I stayed still for a moment, letting the silence in the car prepare my heart. I stepped out of my shiny black car. Julian saw me, and his eyes went wide with shock. His mouth opened, but he couldn't speak for a few seconds. My hands were steady and strong. I didn't feel angry at him anymore. I whispered to myself, "This is the final chapter." I walked slowly toward the auction area, feeling the solid ground under my feet. As I walked past him, I felt Julian move. He reached out his hand, and I saw his fingers shaking. "Leo?" he whispered. His voice was thin and weak. He tried to call my name again, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I knew that looking back would only bring back the old pain. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. I felt a deep sense of relief. It was like a heavy chain had finally broken from my heart. I was no longer the poor boy Julian had kicked out in the rain. I was free. 10 years have passed since that day at the auction. I am now the chairman of Leo's Heritage Furniture, a company I built from scratch with my own hands. I returned to my mother's land, but not to build a mansion. I rebuilt her old house and transformed it into a carpentry museum and a training center for poor children. I felt a warm glow in my chest as I walked through the halls today. I knew that my mother would be proud of this place. I whispered to myself, "Your legacy is safe now." I stood by the window and watched a group of young students. They were learning how to use a wood planer, and their faces were full of focus. I saw a small boy with sawdust on his shirt, smiling at a piece of pine. I took a deep sigh of satisfaction. My hands were no longer shaking with anger. They were steady and strong. The land was green and beautiful again. I had turned a place of betrayal into a place of hope and learning. I heard news about Julian and Clara recently. They lost everything and never recovered. Now, they work as packing laborers in a cold factory far away. I thought about them working in the dark silence of regret. I knew they thought about our mother's land every single day. Julian's eyes are always downcast, and his spirit is broken. Clara no longer dreams of luxury. She only dreams of a life she threw away. I felt a quiet peace, knowing justice had come in its own time. Looking back at my life, I realized that Julian's path was a circle that led to nowhere. Greed is a shortcut that leads to a dead end. Hard work and honesty build a road that lasts forever. I learned that the price of greed is everything you have, but the reward of integrity is everything you deserve. I feel a deep warmth in my heart today because I chose the right way. I whispered to myself one last time, integrity is the only true wealth. I knew that my mother's simple lessons were my best inheritance. In today's world, we often want success overnight. We see people getting rich fast on social media, and we feel jealous of their lives. But remember Julian's story. Shortcuts are very dangerous. First, you must trust your skills, not shortcuts. Your talent is your real security. Second, family is about love, but always protect your legal rights. Never sign a document without reading it carefully first. Finally, remember that success is the best revenge. You do not need to fight or argue with people who hurt you. You only need to grow and succeed. Stay honest, and the world will reward you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Comment yes if you survived, or stay strong to encourage others who are suffering right now. We are a community of learners. Like this story, if you believe in justice and hard work. Subscribe to Peak English Stories for more life lessons and to improve your English skills every day. Thank you for listening to my story. Stay kind, work hard, and I will see you in the next video.